You're okay with us recording, Jono?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's fine, Colin.
that's great. Well, David, where do I start? I migrated to Australia 22 years ago. I came from a country, Malaysia. So I came with my family, and when we came, I guess we were incredibly fortunate to have Australia embrace us as migrants, and we're incredibly indebted to Australia. But for many years, I've lived in Australia. I've realized that there is a lot that Australia could gain from migrants as well as people that are local. Back in 2007, I was very much involved with the Junior Chamber International, and it's a worldwide federation of young leaders and entrepreneurs. And it was that year that we nominate outstanding young persons. In fact, one of the outstanding young persons that we nominate, it's an international award, by the way, from the JCI. And we nominated Tanya Major, who's the Young Australian of the Year in 2007. And she's also an Aboriginal lady. So she took out the award for 10 most outstanding young persons of the year. And so I had the opportunity to really get to know Tanya on a much deeper level. And anyway, she's heard about my story of being a migrant. And long story short, she says, Colin, it's good to see that someone from overseas come to Australia and really make the best use of your time here. And then she proceeded by saying, in Australia, we live in a developed country, and I came from a developing country. But we live in a developed country, and yet we still have 4 out of 5 kids in rural communities that couldn't read or write above minimum standards. And that's when it really hit me, because I am the person that I am today because of the ability for me to be able to read the books, and certainly Bibles, and but it's people that I've been associated with. But just having that ability to read really changed the trajectory of my life, being able to get an education. And so I said, look, Tanya, I didn't know this. I mean, I've lived here for 7, 8 years, and I had no idea that Australia had such a plight and such a problem. And I said, is there something I can do about this? And she goes, well, maybe you can. I said, I'd love to help in some way, shape, or form. And she goes, actually, I know of this school in Colin. Little did I know how far it's going to be. But they've recently been featured on ABC because they've got a very innovative program to get kids to study. And part of that is using rap and rock music, believe it or not. Anyway, she felt that the school was progressive, but they need funds. And she says, actually, I know Rob, who's the school principal. Why don't you give him a call and speak to him directly? So anyway, the next week I gave him a call and I said, Rob, it's Colin here. And, I've heard about you from Tanya. Can I ask what your school needs? And he goes, well, believe it or not, we need funds. That's number one. Number two, we need books. Our library has got a few hundred books, but they're all really old, So it's little things that we take for granted that they don't have. And I remember him saying, we just need funds to get updated computers because we're still using those cathode ray tube computers, the ones with the big monitors.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, geez, I haven't seen that for a while. I'd love to come and take a look at it. So anyway, long story short, I put together a fundraising night, pulled a few of my friends. We raised $10,000 that night, and we collected well and truly over 3,000 books. And the month after that, I drove out to the school. 9 hours later, I arrived in Colin Central School, donated 3,000 books and the money. And I'll never forget that day, just what a profound impact it has had on that school. And so my journey then started. I said to a few of my friends, maybe we can continue this process. And so we set up Bustle Books, which is a non-for-profit that basically collected secondhand children's books from our own community, our own friends. We filled up storage facilities after storage facility. We had Storage King as one of our major sponsors. I was in the newspaper, you name it, everything. It was crazy. We collected more books than we can give away.
Wow.
Anyway, we did that for about 4 years, and I was completely burnt out because I was literally the person that went there and sorted it out. I mean, we had volunteers, but still I was driving these books to these remote communities, and I thought, geez, that was a lot. And look, it was a slightly different season in my life. I had a bit more free time. But the last few years have seen me get into business. So I'm a property advisor and a buyer's agent now. and I'm doing quite well from a business perspective. I've only started this business 3 years ago. I've always been employed full time. But God has been such a blessing to my business at the moment. Like it's going from strength to strength. I now advertise on Hope 103.2, one of their key major sponsors at the moment. And I'm attracting a lot of Christians who just want to talk about wealth and multiplying their gifts and being responsible and faithful for their finances and the many blessings that God's given them. So as a property advisor, my job is to help my clients to build a profitable property portfolio. And I've been growing my team, since 2 years ago. So I've got a little bit more time now, but ever since talking to Jono, which I was involved with I think it's called The Gathering back then. That's how I met Jono. It just re-engaged and reignited my experience when I was running Bussa Books with the Aboriginal community. And I've met a number of Aboriginal communities, and I just feel very strongly to be able to give back to the First Nations, but more specifically to Australia, that has embraced me as a migrant. It's given me so much, and I just feel responsible to give back. Like we have so much to be grateful and to be thankful for, but our very own neighbors, our First Nations people, are not being looked after. So speaking to Jono, it just made sense. I'm very passionate about young people and literacy and providing kids with as many resources to read and to gain an education, really, because that's how you empower them. It's one way of taking them out of poverty and all these issues, social issues that they're going through. So when Jonathan spoke to me about the Bible Society and me being a faith-filled person, I thought, what a great way to be able to connect my faith and the passion for literacy and giving back to these communities. And obviously when Jono spoke to me about the very first children's Bible being translated and produced and printed for Aboriginal children, it just made sense. And I feel very strongly that this is what God has assigned me to do, to be able to help the translation of the Pitjantjatjara Children's Bible, but more importantly, to be able to print and distribute the Bible. So I've embarked on a campaign now in facilitating, as much of my resources. Beck and I, my wife, she couldn't join us, but we've committed that we'll be donating quite a fair bit of amount to the Bible Society by the end of the financial year. And whilst we're doing that, we're also going to be fundraising. So every client that engages with my services, I'm donating 20 Bibles. So that's about $220 per client that I'm engaging. Jono, I haven't updated that figure yet, but we're on 182 Bibles at the moment as we speak. So that's quite a fair bit. And it's only going to continue to grow. So I look at this as an ongoing campaign. It's not something that I'm going to do one off. I'd like for the Pitjantjatjara Children's Bible to be translated, and hopefully to be part of the campaign and the journey, but also the experience of handing out these Pitjantjatjara Bibles to the children.
Yeah, wow, that's fantastic. That's very inspiring.
That's a wonderful summary, Colin. Really appreciate you summarising that. It really. Can I just clarify with the time limit with Dave? So today we've got you in your lunch break for half an hour or so. Is that okay with you? Or what's your time frame? Great. Okay. So I've got a few questions that Colin sent through. So maybe I can ask them, and these might actually be beneficial to Colin's contacts, and we might be able to share this video with them to save you jumping online all the time, as well as actually the wider major donor audience actually out there right around Australia. So if I really try and make sure I sort of finish up in about 25 minutes, so you're free to get back to work. I appreciate your time on this, but just to introduce, like I've already sent links of the video I made when I was out in the desert with you, Dave, delivering the audio Proclaimer Bible, which was a really wonderful experience. But just so briefly, just to summarize what you're doing with Pitjantjatjara language and the art Bible potentially.
Yeah, so I'm sort of coordinating the project. We've got a team of about 15 to 20 translators, but when I say team, I mean translators that work when they can. So a lot of them are employed full-time at the school as teachers or in the art gallery. So these are just faithful, typically women who have parents or grandparents that were involved in the translation of the New Testament many decades ago. And so they grew up seeing their parents and grandparents translate the scriptures and have wanted to take on that role now. So they're very literate, and therefore they're very sought after by white agencies. So I'm often competing for their time, but I'm not sure how much of the actual translation process you understand, but just a few sort of stats. We break down the process into about 5 stages. So there's a front translation, which is an English-based translation that we translate from. And then it goes through a number of drafts. And that drafting process is to make sure the text is both natural in Pitjantjatjara, but also accurate against the original text. So once the translators are happy with it, I then back translate it from the final polished Pitjantjatjara draft back into a very literal English. Okay. And we get a Hebrew consultant to come along and look at the very literal English, just to make sure what's in that final Pitjantjatjara draft is accurate. And then we typeset it and publish the book. So, you know, there's multiple steps to the process. And currently we're 99% finished of the front translation. So we've just about finished that first step. 81% to be precise, of the entire Bible has now got a first draft. I've got these stats here somewhere.
Wow.
51% of the entire Bible has a second draft, and then 44% has a third draft, and 39% has been published. So that's sort of a broad, big picture view of where the project's up to at the moment. As well as that, we're also doing a lot of scripture engagement projects. So like Nami's children's Bible idea we're working on. That idea was birthed quite randomly. I was driving her home from church one Sunday afternoon, and she said, "Look, Dave," I mean, she's in her 60s, so these are all the literate translators. And she said, "Look, I'm really worried about our children and grandchildren. They don't know how to read and write. We grew up listening to these stories and can now read them for ourselves, but that next generation aren't growing up with those stories. I really want to do this art Bible idea. So I want to choose the really significant stories from the Old and New Testaments and come up with some paintings and get all the translators involved, and maybe each translator can work on a painting for the story that they've translated. And I'd love to publish this in a book." So that's kind of how the idea was sort of birthed. And that was about 2 years ago. So since then, we've sat down with all the translators and we've sort of divided up the Bible stories. And the idea is to produce a book that has about 40 to 50 paintings in it.
Wow.
And currently we've done about 15 that are complete.
Wow.
So progress is coming along slowly, but yeah. So, and as well as that, we are doing a devotional book, which is like a prayer book. So a daily reading of the scriptures with a prayer to go with it. And we are also producing some children's Bible readers. So some children's picture books, picture Bible stories with simplified Pitjantjatjara story.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are a few projects happening at the moment.
So do you mind, David, if I ask, so you mentioned that I call it, for lack of a better terminology, the adult Bible, the full version, is being translated, and you gave me those breakdowns. Specifically for the Pitjantjatjara Children's Art Bible, where is that at in terms of percentage of completion?
It's probably about 25% completed. So the first step is to produce all the artwork on canvases, and we've got an art curator that's overseeing that side of things. I don't have an artistic bone in my body, so I'm handballing that to someone that actually is qualified. Right. And she's sort of doing the quality control, so making sure that the paintings are at a level that they can be published. But then the next step after that is to put some scripture with the art book. So just, a very simple summary of what the painting is, just a few words. Because the main idea behind the book is that the people themselves, the adults, can sit down with the children and tell the story from the artwork.
That's
So
right.
we're going to have minimal text, but just enough to.
So is the text completed? It's just the artwork that needs to be completed?
That's right. The text is all complete. So we're going to choose sort of 40 to 50 stories that are already published from Old and New Testament.
Oh, right.
So there's about 15 to 20% of the Old Testament, maybe even 30% of the Old Testament that's been published. So a lot of key stories: Genesis, Exodus, a lot of Psalms, Daniel, Jonah, Ruth. So there's plenty of material that they can work from.
So when you say 25%, that is predominantly the artwork that needs to be completed at this point.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's right. And that equals about 10 to 15 artworks, canvases that have been produced. Yeah.
So if you don't mind me asking, I think for me, the main outcome is just being able to know where the progress is at, and if there is a possibility of, talking about the time frame. When do you, realistically see the Bible completing? And I guess the main question is, what can we do to fast track that process?
Yeah, time frames are notoriously difficult to place on these kinds of projects, just because even last week there were a number of funerals that were happening in Central Australia. So often the artists have to actually go back to community, and they spend, many weeks often in these funerals in sorry camps. And so there are continuous sort of disruptions to the process often. So, we, at the beginning, we were hoping sort of 18 months to 24 months as a time frame. Already it's been 12 months in. So I'd love to say by the end of next year we would have this finished. But there are so many circumstances that can crop up that I have no control over. So, I'm hoping another 18 months.
Okay. So that's just the artwork that needs to be completed, and that's what's taking time?
Yeah, the artwork's the main time consuming.
How many more artworks, or how many more canvases it actually needs to be?
There's probably about 25 to 35 more. So we're paying the artist per canvas. So I think it's about $300 a canvas for their time and for their work. So so there's about 25 to 35 more stories that we can do.
Silly question, but if we double the payment and let's say we paid them $600, would they do it a bit quicker?
Probably not, to be honest. Okay. It's more these extenuating circumstances. So funerals, often they're in hospital for dialysis. There's just family sort of responsibilities and things that hold up the process. Yeah.
Okay. And there's no option for getting other artists involved?
Yeah, we're getting as many as we can. The only dilemma we're having is that some of the people that are literate and wanting to, have a really good understanding of the stories, their art isn't at a level that is sort of publishable. So we're kind of having to be a little bit selective with who we invite into the project, just because it's going to be a published book. We want it to be a really quality product. They have to be a translator and a good grasp of the stories, and then also a pretty decent artist as well.
Wow.
So that kind of limits us a little bit.
Fair enough. It's probably a good segue. I mean, I'm just asking a cheeky question here, but is there a way for us to purchase those artwork? What's happening with that?
It's definitely a discussion we can have with the artists. There has been some talk about doing like an exhibition, I guess, at the end and that kind of thing. So whether we auction or whether they want to sell the artwork, then that's definitely something we can talk with them about. Yeah, definitely.
Okay. I'm super keen.
Yeah, okay. I will. So,
I'll buy a few. I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
So, we'll let them know that that's an option.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, we'd like to really benefit the work out there. And in fact, in future talks with myself and Colin and Rebecca, we may talk about where, if it is going to be another 18 months, maybe potentially also funding other areas of your work, like the actual Old Testament work and things like that. Are you having You getting enough funding lately that you're aware of, Dave, at all? Or
Look, we can always use funding, definitely. And there are always other projects we're doing as we go. So, rather than wait sort of 10, 15 years till we've got a complete Bible before we can get scriptures out, we are constantly publishing books, like individual books. So we finished 1 Samuel last year. We're going to publish that as just a single paperback. I'm chatting with Sam Freeney at the moment, who's Bible Society's translation consultant. He's got a friend at Lexham Press, the general editor, and that Lexham Press have just given us permission to produce their recently published catechism book, so the Apostles' Creed, which is like a kid's picture book, just with a simple sort of 2 or 3 sentences breaking down the creed. So they've given us permission to translate that into Pitjantjatjara. So basically, we're just trying to get as much language resources out as we can. So from a funding point of view, definitely there's huge needs that we have all the time. And if there are other projects you want to take ownership of and just get behind, and then yeah, we'd definitely be grateful for any support. But yeah, so there are a few of the things we're working on.
David, I know I've asked Jonathan this before, but in your own opinion, what's unique about Pitjantjatjara, and because obviously we're doing the very first children's art Bible, but specifically in the Pitjantjatjara translation, but why not Curial or something else? Why Pitjantjatjara?
Good question. Look, in terms of where Bible translation projects are up to, Pitjantjatjara is probably one of the most advanced, and that's partly because of the history of how the mission was established in Central Australia. So if you look at like Jonathan's map above his left-hand shoulder that I can see in the background, that's the one, Jono. Typically around the east coast, around the coast of Australia, that's where a lot of those languages have died out, or some are being revived at the moment. But as a rule, the further inland you go, the later those languages were settled by mission. So they typically are the strongest languages.
Okay.
So Pitjantjatjara, being the traditional language around Uluru, is one of the most strongest and widely spoken languages today, which is partly why it's such an advanced language in terms of the translation project. And it also means it's one of the most viable languages in terms of there are thousands of Pitjantjatjara speakers today, whereas a lot of other languages.
That's great. That's wonderful. So in terms of the most widely spoken, and I've tried to Google this, but I can't tell which is which, but where does Pitjantjatjara sit in terms of the most used language? What's the top, 1, 2, and is Pitjantjatjara anywhere up there? Do you know or not?
I'd say it would be sort of in the top 5, and that's just pulling a figure off the top of my head. I'd have to check. I know there are a lot of strong top-end languages, but in terms of Central Australia, and the other thing is with Pitjantjatjara, it's got a number of neighbouring dialects which are very similar. So Yankunytjatjara, Nganyatjatjara, Nyatjatjara, they're sort of neighbouring dialects that each have another 3,000 or 4,000 speakers.
Right.
And they could understand Pitjantjatjara very easily. Okay. And that's one of the spin-offs of this project, is that once we've got the Pitjantjatjara scriptures translated, in theory, we should be able to translate some of these neighbouring dialects a lot quicker, because they've basically got a language that's 95% compatible. So yeah, we're sort of focusing a lot of resources in Pitjantjatjara at the moment, but there's no reason that can't have a massive spin-off down the track once we get this done.
Yeah, amazing. Something just came.
Dave, as well.
Sorry.
It's significant as well, Dave, because the Creole is the only full Aboriginal Bible, and that one is actually kind of not even really a traditional Aboriginal language. It's more like a pidgin version. Is that right? Yeah,
that's exactly right, Jono. So Pitjantjatjara is, hopefully it will be the first traditional language that has a complete Bible. So it's crazy that this, 250 years whitefellas have been in this land, and there's still no complete Aboriginal language, traditional Aboriginal language with a Bible.
So this is going to be a massive celebration in the centre of Australia. It's going to be huge.
Yeah, historically, it's a huge, significant event. Yeah.
David, sorry, something just came to my mind because you said that you're publishing each book at a time, but can we not do that the same for the children's Bible? So instead of like a thick Bible, maybe just a thin one. So let's say Genesis, we've got 2 or 3 pictures of it. Can we just not publish a thin, children's Bible about Genesis? Would that be a possibility? Have you explored that?
Yeah, this children's Bible is mainly about the illustrations, the artwork itself. So there's going to be very minimal text, which means there'll be some books that don't have any artwork done for them at all. So we've got 40 to 50 paintings that have to cover both Old and New Testaments. So yeah, I think we'll have to get them all done before we can publish this.
Fair enough. Wow.
But that's not to say that we can't do some other things like create a children's Bible just in Genesis.
Is there a chance that we can actually kind of have a look at people working, Dave? I know that probably a lot of people ask you, and travel's been restricted with COVID and things like that, but we'd love to be able to see things in process or just meet some of the translators where it's convenient, like Alice Springs, or where you actually meet with them in the middle of where's the village you actually meet them to translate, where you live?
There's about 10 communities. So the APY lands is the sort of main Pitjantjatjara country, which is sort of northwest of South Australia, sort of Uluru down. But we've got translators in 3 or 4 of those communities that I go to. Problem is, the last couple of years, it's really hard to get a permit to these lands because you have to be an essential worker only because of the COVID stuff. So I've actually had to scrap a couple of trips I've planned. I'd planned to take a couple of trips from groups from Melbourne last year, had to scrap that. So I am planning a workshop in Alice Springs, potentially September or October. And that's probably, from a logistics point of view, easier to have people come and drop in on that kind of a workshop rather than go to the lands. It's hard with the lands because there's no accommodation. There are very few facilities. You can rock up and not be sure that there are going to be people in the community, like there might be a funeral on 300 k's away, so people might be not there at the time. So yeah, probably one of those regional towns is the best way to come and see some live translation.
So Alice Springs, maybe go with the Desert Festival, the Desert Song Festival is on, then that may be a good thing to combine with. So if you're able to keep us in the loop, we may be able to work something out there together, but we don't want to get in the way. We'd love to be able to just support and encourage in any way.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Yeah. I think the Desert Festival's end of September, I've got a feeling. So that could work. Yeah.
No, that's brilliant. And maybe, David, I know you've got to go soon, but just two very quick questions. I think one is, obviously I'm talking to my own supporters as well, and I'd love to be able to get people on the same page, but do you have a message for anyone who's thinking about helping, the translation of the Pitjantjatjara Bible, and just your understanding of the impact it's going to have in that community? And just to finish off, I'd love to know, how do you say Jesus and God and love in Pitjantjatjara? That's okay, unless you don't know. So anyway.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Like in terms of the impact this translation work's having in the community, well, a couple of things actually. Like the language is changing all the time. Like words are literally dying and being left out of the language and being lost from the language every day. So one of the things this translation work is doing is actually preserving the language. Like I've got a Pitjantjatjara dictionary here, and I'm literally, every few weeks I'm writing down a word that's in our scriptures in the translation that is not in the dictionary yet. So if it wasn't for the translation work, this language would be lost, literally. So that's one thing the translation work's doing, just from a sort of socio-linguistic point of view. In terms of the impact the scriptures are having, I mentioned before this devotional book we were working on, this prayer book recently, and a couple of years ago, I'm not sure if you heard of there was a young fella in Yuendamu that was shot by a policeman and died. Not sure if that made it to the East Coast, that news, but it was a really significant event in Central Australia. It impacted a lot of the communities, and there was just a lot of anger and frustration confusion. I remember sitting down with one of the translators working on this prayer book, and she was explaining, it just happened, and she was explaining what had happened. And, you know, there were people talking about doing riots in Alice Springs, and just a lot of uproar and unrest in these communities. And it just so happened that we were writing a prayer that morning for the story of Cain and Abel in this devotional book that we're working on. And she was working away on this prayer, basically saying something like, you know, Lord, forgive us this anger that's in our hearts. You know, we're all like Cain. We've all got that in us. And halfway through her writing this prayer, I could see the Spirit was just bringing this story into her heart. And it just dawned on her, everything we'd just been talking about was in her human heart. You know, she was as capable of this sort of violence, and we all are, that she'd been seeing on TV. And so it went from her writing this prayer based on this story of Cain and Abel to us literally stopping and praying, Lord, have mercy on us, forgive us, you know, bring your mercy and your gospel of reconciliation to these communities, because we've all got this in us. And yeah, it just struck me, wow, this is the word of God actually having an impact at that real heart level. Wasn't theoretical at that point. It was, yeah, it's where the rubber hits the road. So yeah, that was one instance of this, the impact this translation work's having, which is, it's incredible when you get to see that up close.
Wow.
Can you share a couple of words at the?
Yeah, so I was thinking of Jesus the other, doing Greek at the moment. Jesus is Jesus. So our English word follows the Greek pretty closely, and Pidgin Data is the same. So Jisunya is how they would say Jesus. Jisunya. Jisunya, yeah. And God Anya for God. So you can hear the resemblance there. Jisunya and God.
We talked about glory when we were in the middle of the desert, sitting around a fire that time, Dave.
Yeah, glory is an interesting one, because obviously there's no, well, it's not obvious, but there is no word for glory in Pidgin Data, and it's a really hard concept to communicate. So we're trying to explain what glory is, you know, when you're overwhelmed with God's presence and that sort of bright light, you know, of his presence. And the word they came up with that was the equivalent was the burning embers in the coals. You know, you get that glow from the coals, which is pidalji. And so that has just become the word for glory. So whenever the word glory comes up in the scriptures, they have to translate it. They use this pidalji. And pidalji purka is incredibly glorious. So, yeah. And that's another way language changes as well. It's sort of, you can add meaning to words that had one meaning once upon a time. Now this word has a nuanced meaning.
That's amazing. And love is there?
Love, mukulya. Yeah.
Wow.
So God anyanganampa mukulya. God loves us.
Wow. That's amazing.
Hey, Dave, really appreciate your time, mate. I know you've got to get back to work, and
No worries.
but it's so grateful for all that you're doing. We find it hard to understand the challenges because it's such a different culture, but we'll be praying for you. And,
thanks, Jono. Yeah,
and
and thank you, Colin, so much for all your support. It's I'm so encouraged and inspired by your faithfulness. So yeah, thank you, and thank your team as well. Really appreciate it.
For sure.
Well, I'll stay in touch and I'll let you get back. Colin and I can maybe just stay and have a chat.
Yeah, for sure.
Great.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much, guys.
Yes, mate.
Thank you.
God bless.
Bye.
Should we stop recording or?
Yeah, we could probably stop now.